put it on screen here. You guys have seen this process, right? And this is what we had talked about earlier on with you all, and kind of established this process as the internal grant making process for ACS. And it really does, a lot of it has to do with how CHI proceeds. So I'd like to hear a lot about, maybe Janelle, maybe you taking us through this process again with some of the detail that you provided on your project setup. Because what we want to do is capture detail as we go through this so that we can then begin developing the cards to help move this along for you all. So if you want to start with where we're going and the opportunity notification, just take us through the RFA development process and identify the different players that are involved. I can bring up your Word document if that might be helpful as a memory too.
I think that will be helpful. The workflow that you have here, I like it a lot, but it's really quite abbreviated. So I think the other one gives a bit more context and detail. So if everyone's okay with that, I would like to use that one instead. And let me know, because I'll just go through this, and unless I hear someone ask me to pause to clarify anything, or maybe if there's on the global side something where we need to discuss where there might be a modification, but then also I'll follow your lead as to if you want us to interject during, or if you want us to hold off.
Okay.
But
anytime there's a deviation, or anytime that maybe global, anytime that global has a deviation from this, that would be helpful if they would just pop in as well.
Sure.
So that'd be great.
So for the CHI team, we collaborate very, very closely with the revenue team to identify where there are funding opportunities. Once we have a contract with a potential, or once we have a contract with a funder, sort of between that proposal phase to the funder and our team sort of preparing for that contract to be signed, we begin to draft the RFA. We design the RFA in its entirety, linking the funding opportunity to evidence-based interventions. We have two processes now, or two funding opportunity sort of documents now. We abbreviated one very recently, and that's the RFCF, essentially for continuation funding. We have further streamlined and abbreviated the application process for those projects that have indicated that they are progressing satisfactorily, so that they're not completing what we would call a full application. So that's the distinction between the RFA and RFCF. Because we design and develop our own RFAs internally, the CHI team, we have our own review process that starts with us and our individual members reviewing that RFA and RFCF from the concept of, from the sort of linking back to the original concept, reviewing it from the context of what were we doing in the first year versus moving into an RFCF. And so you'll see here that we've outlined, it depends upon who's taking the lead to actually design the RFA. That helps to determine who then is reviewing that. Then we move into finalizing the applications, and then developing, that also prompts us to develop the collaborative agreement form. And so this is not necessarily as linear as it might look because we're doing multiple things sometimes at the same time. So moving from drafting that RFA to having that review to finalizing that, at the same time working with Laura Sheehan, also going back to agreements that we've already developed, to establish the collaborative agreement form, which would be applicable to an RFA, which is a new project, versus an amendment, which would be applicable to a continuation application. Okay. Because this is also very much so a collaborative process, and we work through and with our division colleagues, we will frequently give them an opportunity to weigh in on whether or not the RFA or the RFCF has room for improvement. So you'll see here that we have the change advisory group that's comprised of senior directors that primarily work with the primary care systems, and also because of our partnership with the Stats and Eval Center. So we'll have a few stakeholders take a look at that RFA and the RFCF. And so the distinction that you see between 1 to the 3rd line and then the 6th line is that the CHI team has a process where we're finalizing those documents, and then there's another process where there's a formal finalization, once it's had an opportunity to go through key stakeholders. Any questions?
Yeah, a question for you. Is Lori part of your team or somewhere?
No, Lori is with corporate counsel.
Okay.
Yep.
But Kim and Bobby and Stephen are on, and not are your team.
Yes.
Okay.
So once we have finalized the documents, because the RFCF is a continuation opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, we have refined that even further from what we used to call a continuation RFA to reduce the administrative burden. In addition to streamlining the form itself, the CHI team also plays a role in pre-populating that RFCF. There are a couple of sections, more of the background information that we can pre-populate from the original proposal to include the organizational background information, point person, the interventions, some of that information that, although there may be change, for the most part we anticipate will remain static from one year to the next. So there are, as I mentioned, a couple of sections that are being pre-populated on the RFCF before we release the RFA and or the RFCF. I'm not sure if this is relevant, but I'll give it just in case it has anything to do with how the workflow might be modified. In order to understand which projects are moving forward to the RFCF, we do have to consult with the divisions, because the divisions have the latitude to determine if they want to move an existing funder or existing partner to continuation funding versus start with a brand new partner. We allow our grant recipients, depending upon their performance, to provide to apply for continuation funding if they're eligible for up to 3 years. So there's some variation there. If divisions, for example, say this partner has received funding for 2 years, they're doing well, we can help them to sustain this without more funding. We'd like to move into a new funder or a new partner at this time. So there's some work that goes into understanding if we're going to pre-populate an RFCF and release that versus an RFA.
Okay. Do you track these differently? Is there a code field that you use on the RFA or the RFCF that is sort of a key field that you do your reporting from?
I don't know that I fully understand the question, Ken.
Is there a number, for example, on the RFA that would? At
this time, no.
Okay, so you track by program or program name, or?
Yes, we track by funder, then community, then project title, which is not as convoluted as it may sound. But I think that it would be helpful moving forward that this is absolutely tracked by project number or project ID.
So tracking by project number ID would be suffice?
Yes, absolutely. That will give us an opportunity, rather than the way that we have to do this manually now, where essentially we send out a list to the divisions, they weigh in, we sort of populate this spreadsheet to track, are they moving into RFCF or do they need an RFA? Being able to do that through the system by ID, I think, will streamline things. I have not seen where it's necessarily problematic with this manual process, but if we can automate that I think would increase our efficiency.
And would that tracking ID need some type of nomenclature, or do you want auto-generated?
I don't know, Tony.
Janelle, I have a quick question. Is your intent to have the divisions participate in an approval process for moving things?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so you'll see a few lines down that the divisions will actually conduct what we are calling the very first round of reviews. That is an opportunity for divisions to have visibility to the proposal before it's officially move to the CHI team for review, and also room for them to send back to their partner the application if they need to make any modifications.
Okay.
This is Justine. I think all this sounds pretty much in alignment with a lot of the things that I think if we were to do an RFA would be the same. So it's very helpful to look at Jonelle's presentation of this. The only question I would have is that if we had different kinds of RFAs going out that had different levels of review, like some were just internal cancer control for this kind of RFA and the other one, say, does involve the divisions, would we be able to have that kind of branch off of different formats? Or how, I'm trying to visual how committed it is to the structure.
So what we would do is we would build it out with different themes for different types of process. So we probably would have one process where it goes out to the division, and another process where it just goes stays internally to your organizational group. And the other part of that is that I think that when a solicitation is announced, there's going to be a little bit of configuration that's required anyway on posting that solicitation, and that's going to need to be done by one of your internal admins. We need to figure out what that looks like. That means that they'll also have to be adjusting the workflow for that specific theme. So you'll have a lot of flexibility in how you want to configure that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Jolene, do you track the RFA in a separate way that you do from the RFCF? Do they need different numbers or a numbering nomenclature?
Yes, they will need different numbers. And Justine, I'm glad that you raised that question, because there will be times when if there's an RFCF, it does not need to go through a formal peer review. There are going to be times when the CHI team alone will weigh in on the merit of an RFCF and determine whether or not it moves forward to receive that continuation funding. Just as an example, right now, Ken and Richard and Bobby, we've not met yet, but I anticipate we'll work quite a bit together moving forward. We are now working on an RFA and an RFCF for NFL projects. Some of our projects are moving into their third year funding. Some are moving into their first year funding, which would trigger that RFA. We right now have the coding of the funding opportunity is linked with whether or not it's an RFA versus an RFCF. We don't necessarily need new numbers, but the ID itself includes the abbreviation RFA or RFCF, just so that distinction is clear.
Okay, that helps. Thanks. Okay.
Would you like me to move forward?
Yeah, I think that was all the questions we had for this section. So
okay,
that sounds good.
So once we release that RFA, and sometimes even before we formally release, we are working on the review form. So that will be the form that's used to determine and score the merit of the proposal. Moving from there, we're also working with the ACS senior directors. They're responsible for identifying their applicants. This is why we release through our divisions, because it's their say as to which partners they select for these funding opportunities, and that's based upon different criteria. So while they're identifying the potential grantees, this is blue because this is new for us. This is the future state. This is not currently anything that we necessarily map, although the process with this manual process, it's a given that they're first identifying who will apply. But given the transition to Flux, once they identify those grantees, they'll need to provide that list to us. And I'm not sure, Ken and Richard, if this is sequenced properly. So the identification of the potential grantees, and then the grantees are verified and approved. This, again, is a role that the senior directors will play. The grant applicant list is supplied to us, and then there's account provisioning. I I would look to you to tell us if this is sequenced properly.
I think it's
from a logical
fine.
perspective, it really seems.
It's fine. The applicants just need to be there before they can apply to the for the RFA. And it sounds like the applicants that you have are going to be repeat offenders. So they will likely be in the system already, and you'll just be reaching out to them for hey, there's a new opportunity, a re-up that you want to apply for.
Richard, you cut out on me at one point. So
Sorry.
what I think you're saying is that for the continuation applicants, they'll already be in the system. But what would be the process for a new applicant?
For a new applicant, they would be. I think this is the right point to identify. They'd be identified. Their list comes to you, and their account provisioned is the right sequence of steps. As long as they are there before you release the solicitation, they will be adequately notified.
So I'm a little confused with that, but I don't want to hold things up. So
let me ask a question here, Jolene, if I can. How do you interface? You said this is a kind of a new process, but how do you anticipate interfacing with the senior directors? Is that typically through email, or are those face-to-face meetings? What's the interaction mode?
It's through email. So typically when we release an RFA, we release the RFA directly to the 11 senior directors across the country. And then they move forward with discussing internally who they will, with which partners they'll engage to determine which move forward into the application process. With Flux, I would imagine that there would be a similar process, but instead of the RFA technically going to the senior directors would need to advise us of the applicants who are eligible to apply. Which is why we thought that it would move from identifying the potential grantees to verifying and approving that, which happens at the senior director level. And then the senior directors would be responsible for providing us with the applicant list so that we know that even if an application is submitted, that it's already been vetted with the division.
Right. Okay.
Gotcha. No, I think I need to think through that a little bit more, Danielle. So I may separate on that point.
Okay. And Richard, one thing too, because this piece is so new to us, absolutely look to your expertise to tell us what makes most sense. What we're really trying to protect and preserve, how it gets done, we are flexible, but what we must preserve is that this is not a public RFA. It is not publicly released and cannot be publicly released across the nation.
Right.
Direct to the community, I should clarify.
So I would suggest that the RFA link is just provided to individual accounts. There's actually a couple of ways of doing that, and let me play with it. I have a couple of different ideas on how to approach that now that you've said that.
Okay. Okay. And Justine, question for you. Do you do a public release? I know that you populate some of the applications internally, but would you need sort of that same workflow to be applicable for global, where you have the right to limit or restrict who gets access?
I think that having both would be probably great, because I do think that for the Global Scholars Program that will be pretty free and open. But I imagine with the conversations that we've had that sometimes it'll just be a certain country or set of organizations, or a certain criteria probably need to be met even before applying, but maybe that could also be found in the application. I don't think we have the same degree of privacy restriction that you have, but having some kind of limitation might be ideal at some point. So hopefully that answers the question. But right now, I actually think the public is fine for what is actually being worked on at this time.
Okay. So the next two lines is more internal, not necessarily anything that we would integrate into a workflow that's specific to Flux, but essentially what it's acknowledging is that once we release an RFA, the CHR team is providing technical assistance beginning at the point of release to ensure that the senior directors have the support that they need. We tend to get tripped up a lot around data, quantitative data. And so the CHI team is providing technical assistance. Ken and Richard, this is one of the areas where I would love for Flux to have some validation so that those calculations are limited in their room for discrepancy.
Okay.
But Ken, if you would scroll down a little bit. So in addition to that technical assistance, we're also just checking in with the divisions to check in on timely submission for NIDA for us to consider internally. I think that we need to discuss how frequently we'll want to do that, considering that we'll have Flux. But I would imagine that transitions from you having a conversation or sending a personal email versus Flux sending an automated reminder email. And Richard and Ken, I'm not sure of the feasibility there, but that's something that we would want to consider versus sending these separate or one-off emails from our ACS email boxes.
Okay, we
could do both.
Okay.
There's an email component that we can use. Are these ad hoc emails or are these canned emails?
They can absolutely be canned. Essentially, it's a prompt, it's a reminder to say, you know, the applications are due by this date. We could include some additional messaging, so it's not quite that,
Yeah.
so that it's not that cut and dry. But I do think that it can be canned because we wouldn't get into a lot of individuals or customized emails at that time.
Okay. Then yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
We can certainly generate automated emails to go to individual grantees or applicants.
Okay. Ken, I have a question for you. Is this approach to going through this process, does this work for you?
It does, and what it does is it provides us at least some discussion points. Because as you're talking, we're taking notes and actually making determinations on how to construct the build, at least from the first blush. So it's not going to be the first and only. Obviously, we're going to have some other discussions that are going to be following this. But as we get into the build, we'll come back and say, did we capture what we needed to capture at this point in time? We build it where we needed to build it. So it's a great starting point.
Okay, sounds good.
So can I ask one more question? Sorry, I was thinking back about Janelle, the question that you asked about the public and limited access. For the system, I'm just imagining if for some reason we did get a certain number of applicants that was a little bit more astronomical than that could be reviewed, is there a way to have certain criteria in the beginning of the application that weeds out certain people that already don't meet the basic qualifications, or are we always going to be sorting through a large group of applications? I'm just thinking because sometimes if the divisions aren't involved, it's just us, so.
So it really depends on the application.
Does that make sense?
On the components that we add into the application. If it's a completely open application, you can add a letter of intent or a qualification statement up front or a survey in front of the application. So if you don't meet these criteria, don't press the go button.
Okay.
We can do that on their registration letter of intent, or we can do that on the application itself. There are two places we can kind of capture that.
Okay, great, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so I mentioned several steps earlier. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, that said, If those surveys or those different types of surveys are something that we need to accommodate in the front of the applications, then we'll need to figure out what the base set of questions are, so we can create a template for you, so that you don't have to recreate it every time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So several steps earlier, we acknowledged that we would work on the review scoring form. At this point, within the workflow, it would be time to recruit the actual review team. As I mentioned earlier, there will be some situations with the RFCF where a review team is not needed because the CHI team will handle the abbreviated review processes. We included this step, but you'll see that we have a question mark, and that's because it's a new step for us as we transition to Flux, where there will need to be some level of provisioning for the review team, where it's determined what degree of access they receive, who they are, and I'm not sure of the additional steps related to this process, but we wanted to at least acknowledge that that needs to happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. So there's whoever is doing the provisioning of these reviewers basically will need to have admin rights on the system so that they can adjust individuals' account status. So that person will need to have the ability, or will have the ability, to do it across divisions, across CHI and global, across SPO. It's really an account management position. So we might want to talk about whether or not that there are individuals located within your groups that have elevated roles or elevated admin responsibilities to do account provisioning, or if it's a function that you want to turn back over to someone in IT. Basically somebody like Kirsten has the admin right in order to be able to perform that function, and you just forward on an email to them or a request onto them saying this person needs to have their admin rights changed to be so that they also have their rights changed to become a reviewer. There are a couple ways of doing it, but I think it's as soon as you give people access to the admin console, it opens up potential places where things can get changed inadvertently.
Sure. And Richard, this is Jonelle. My opinion on that is, to go with the consensus of the key stakeholders here, I would be happy to turn that over to Kirsten. I don't know if Kirsten is expecting that will be her responsibility. If it is not, if each sort of stakeholder group needed to advise or sort of identify an admin person, the CHI team would identify that one point person so that we alleviate the concern that you just mentioned.
Yeah, it's just that I'm not making a recommendation one way or the other in terms of who your admins are. It's just something that I think needs a little bit of discussion.
Hey, Jonelle, I'm sorry. Are you referencing Kirsten Wilson?
That's who I thought Richard referenced.
I mentioned Kirsten by name because that's the person that I've been talking to about admin stuff. That may not be her function within the organization, and I'm certainly not trying to make assignments in that respect.
Thank you.
Just
to clarify, thanks.
I did have a question too. The senior directors are clearly very involved in this entire process, and I was wondering if you would want them as maybe a participant within the Flux system or have access to the Flux system, or is this something that you would rather have outside Flux and have these interactions with them be kind of like via email or conference calls that then your group record within Flux?
My preference would be the first option, so that the senior directors are accountable and responsible for their particular roles without the CHI team needing to feed it to them. I think also because we have, and we've only briefly touched on this, but we do have a local program which is similar to Change, but it's local projects. And I do anticipate, Gail, that we're moving forward to have Flux serve as that repository for those CE projects, which means the senior directors will need to know how to function in Flux already. So my preference would be to give them that access point versus us needing to sort of filter it to them.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
I assume we're going to have a separate discussion around access rights and who does what, right?
Yeah, I think we need to.
Right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, right. I was just looking at it from more of a higher level where we wanted to go with this. So. Okay, Janelle, thanks.
Alrighty, so we have recruited the review team. We have given them their rights within Flux. We move, well, not necessarily move from there, but at the same time, divisions need access to their applicant proposals because on an ongoing basis, they should be monitoring the completion of the application. They should be weighing in on the merit of the proposal, where there's room for opportunity, any red flags. If it's an RFCF, any inconsistencies with what the original funding stream was intended to do. So throughout the process, they will have access, and we're calling it a preliminary review because a few steps down, you'll also see that they have to conduct that first round of reviews. So the divisions are conducting the preliminary review, monitoring. Applications are due and submitted by the grantee, and then the divisions are the frontline reviewers. So if it does not get by the divisions, it does not come to the CHI team for formal review. But once it does get that approval, now Ken and Richard, what we haven't discussed is what happens if it stops there. And that's maybe something to parking lot for a later discussion. I'm curious to know, just for my own purposes, how if something gets stopped, how the CHI team is aware that it gets stopped, how the division and the applicant is aware that if it does not move to approval by the deadline, it stops as a requirement because the deadline has not been met.
So we would put a workflow state in that basically traps it as a pending submission, and
Okay.
and then we can determine what types of emails are sent out or notifications are sent out at that place. At that point, you'd end up with a filtered card that basically collected all of those, and then you would. I know what other people have done in the past, or other grantee or other foundations have done in the past is they've basically used that pending bin to collect everybody and then make a bulk notification to the grantees that you're not funded or something like that, in a nicer tone, of course, so that message is put out at one time and everybody, and you're not automatically sending messages out that you then have to respond to on an individual basis.
Okay, that's helpful to know. Thank you. So let's see. Once the divisions complete their approval process, the CHI team, and this is something that maybe we should flag because if we're moving into this new process, I'm not sure how much administrative burden I want to keep on the CHI team to conduct this preliminary review. But the way that it stands now, just to give you a little context, and maybe you can give us some guidance here, based upon practices that you see across the industry in general, the CHI team is conducting a preliminary review because we're wanting to determine if the application has been, first of all, if it's been completed in its entirety, if it's completed by an eligible applicant, but this may be some things that we can cover with that qualifications check on the front end.
Right.
If we integrate that into the process. Because if they're not an SQHC, if they're not within an eligible geography, if they are not sort of aligned with some of the basics, I would love to have Flux be able to just stop them in their tracks versus have them go through, similar to what Justine was mentioning, a full application that then just, comes through that process where we're then required to take some action on it.
So we can certainly hide the submission button based on ineligibility flags.
Okay.
But typically, what we'll do is we'll say, here are the eligibility criteria. If you meet them, then we'll show you the rest of the form, and you can fill it out.
Okay.
Applicants can always game the form so that they can submit it anyway, and then they're just wasting their time and your time.
Okay, that's helpful to know. So saying that again to say that I don't know that we will need to hold on to that preliminary review that the CHI team will have. I'm sorry, Tim, can you scroll down for me?
I think it's a good place. It's a good placeholder to have a workflow state for preliminary review, and then if you're doing a quick eyeball check and moving it on to, and potentially an assignment to other types of review states.
Okay. You wanted to go down? This way?
No, I'm sorry. Actually, go. I
go back
there might be a lag on my end. I'm sorry. So this is perfect. So that line where it says the CHI team conducts a preliminary review, and then if modifications are required, those are the two things that may go away, because if there's a validation check, even, with the understanding, Richard, what you just mentioned, that they may be able to just sort of trick the system and being able to submit an application even if they technically are not eligible. But we'll need to sort of red flag these two lines to determine if this is necessary to move into the future state workflow.
Right.
Same with that third one, division review modifications, secondary review of modifications. Right now, that's part of our manual process because we're collaborating with the divisions. In some instances, if an application does not pass the preliminary review, if we're saying we need modifications, and then that sort of repeats that review process all again. So beginning with the CHI team all the way to secondary review of modifications, ideally, this will go away.
Okay.
So let's say we go from the process of the grantee has submitted the application, the divisions review the application. Ideally, we would be able to skip to running an application summary. That will give us some insight as to how many applications were received. For example, if we're looking at the eligibility criteria, ideally, how many did not meet eligibility. There's some basic data points that we like to track in our summary. I think you have a copy of our application, our master application summary. That right now is an Excel spreadsheet that captures the project, the partner name, the project title, the interventions, and the targets. Those are some basic data points that we would want to be able to track as part of this application summary report.
I'm pretty sure we have that. If we don't,
okay,
we'll circle back.
Okay.
Quick question. I should have asked this at the very beginning. The parts in blue is that indicative of something? The blue means something?
You know, I have to tell you, I saw this after Nada and Kim and Bobby worked on it. I don't know what the blue means, so I'll ask Nada or Kim to answer that question.
I think those were this is Nada. I think those were areas that when we went through, we were just marking for ourselves so that we weren't missing certain points because, we were making some revisions. So for myself, this wasn't indicative of anything critical except just for our own reference point.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
All right, so moving from running that application summary sheet, that report, the review members have been notified of their assignments, and then they move into the process to complete the review. We talked a little bit in one of the earlier, I think it's the Discovery meeting in Atlanta, that the score forms are weighted based upon significance of the category. But ideally, that will be taken care of within a Flux system with the flexibility to make modifications as the RFA dictates the need to make those modifications. So once the review process is complete, we rely on the review team to help us determine the final funding determination. So if an application is funded, not funded, or recommended for funding with modifications, From there, we are advising the applicants of their funding status. Ideally, that will happen all through an automated process. And I'm not sure how Flux functions or what the capacity is, but what we like to do in the event that a project is not funded or if it's recommended for funding with modifications, that the system would also give the applicant that feedback so that we're not doing sort of a separate email to give the review or the feedback or where the modifications are required.
So you want the review recommendations to go back to the applicant. Do you want them to go back individually, or so if you have 5 reviewers on an application, and each reviewer gives different comments, different assessments of the, you want all of those reviews to go to the applicant, or do
we do a consolidated review. Okay. So we don't do individual review in the end. So typically we have 2 reviewers per team. Mm-hmm. Those reviewers, part of their process, and actually I erroneously deleted that line. There was a line that did reference that the reviewers will submit one consolidated review form.
Okay.
And that is the consolidated review form that the applicant would receive. We also, just as an important note for us, because this is an internal process, we do not disclose reviewer names, so we would need the ability to keep that piece confidential.
Yep. As
we share the consolidated review form with the applicant.
Okay. So I won't tell you how we're going to do it now. I've got some ideas. Okay. Quick question on the roles. So the Bobby is a lead on a lot of different activities, and some of those activities seem to be shared with other people. Are there specific roles or functions that only Bobby or only Nadar will be performing? Or is it
Bobby in general, Bobby is lead on our review processes. So she's the one recruiting the reviewer, she's the one training the reviewer, she's the one making the assignments of the applications. She's the point person to receive that consolidated review and to determine, based upon that review, or at least to draft the message that would then go to the applicant.
Okay, so a functional role would be something like review manager. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and then kind of going back up the line, the Nadar's functional role, what would that be if in the system?
So Nadar will have final say over the RFA and RFES that gets released. So you'll see here that her name is listed for draft, but then also for finalizing of that RFA and the RFES. And I'm not sure how to give a functional label here because I don't know that it's that black and white. But essentially, Nadar will have say over all of it. As a director of change, she will be able to determine if an RFA gets drafted, if it gets released, who ultimately, in turn, if there's a do not fund recommendation, who actually is not funded versus who is.
Okay.
She will, although Kim is going to be point person to develop that collaborative agreement, Nadar will be the one to finalize it based upon her clarity of the funding opportunity in its entirety.
Okay. So if we had a functional role for a change director and a subordinate role for change manager, Would that work? And then use that change manager for Kim and Deborah. I'm trying to I'm trying to think for different people as different people interact with the system. I'm trying to group their roles.
Sure.
Every individual
Sure, understand.
separate.
So I think that, so you're absolutely right, listing Nada as Director of Change. I would, and I like that you have Bobby listed as the review manager or the manager of the review process. If I had to give you a functional label for Kim and Deborah, I think that it would be more of a support role.
Okay.
For change.
So change support administrator?
No. Well, when you say administrator, that's where I guess I get hung up, and I apologize for the rest of you because this may be painful. So Kim and Deborah each separately have administrative responsibilities related to change. However, Kim technically covers a broader portfolio than change, as does Bobby, whereas Nada, Stephen, and Deborah are directly aligned with the change program. So that's where I'm struggling a little bit, and I don't want us to get caught up with this because it's maybe an offline conversation, but I do understand the intention here.
So maybe it could just be a program support label or category, and all of them could have that same function. I'm just thinking in terms, unless there is a hierarchy in terms of who can sign off on what.
Okay,
we could probably discuss this too later.
Yeah.
Hey,
which is fine. Maybe give her a little bit of an idea of give you some time to think about it. It sounds like you might need a little bit of time to think about it, Janelle.
Yeah, Ken, I'm sorry. This is probably something we need to discuss in another meeting so that we can ensure Janelle's thought it through and that those are also, whatever is assigned is also something that we can use with in global as well. Mm-hmm. But I want to stop the meeting at this point because it's almost 11 o'clock. And I know Tony and myself both have other meetings at 11, so it looks like we're going to have to reschedule another meeting to continue this conversation. And
I have a question for you. I need to interrupt you because this is probably the best time for me to finish this. So do you and Tony need to stay on the line? I mean, and I'm happy to stay on the line just with Kim and Richard to finish this, unless you all feel as though you need to take part.
Well, the only reason I would... Well, let me ask this. Richard, are you recording this?
I am recording it just to make sure that I have my notes all straight.
Okay.
As long
so Janelle, you can stay on the line. The only reason I mentioned Tony and myself was so that one of us could listen in, but if Richard is recording it, then I'm okay with that.
Okay, and Richard and Ken, are you okay to stay on for another maybe 10 minutes to get through this?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Did you want to say anything? Come on. So Knock and Kim and Laquita, they're going to, I don't know if this room is occupied at 11, so you might get kicked out, but they're going to stay in as long as they can.
I think it is
okay.
At 11.
All right. But there are people like me who reserve it and then don't use it for whatever reason, so.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So, yeah, we're all about to jump off.
Yeah, we'll jump off. If we go back to our office, we can jump back on, we will.
Okay. Sounds good.
You all continue on.
This just means I'm going to stay.
Okay.
Thanks.
I need to find my place here again.
Yeah, me too. Okay. Okay, so yes, the consolidated review form is submitted. Funding, we determine if they will receive the funding or not. We advise them if they receive the funding or not. If a modification is required, then they'll need to resubmit the application. I don't know if you want to use a word other than resubmit because we use that language, but I'm not sure if there's a better term to use given that it's already within flux. They're making modifications, and then those modifications need to come back to us.
I don't think we really know at this point, so we'll make that determination.
Okay, and so once we have made those determinations, Kim is working on the finance side to make sure that, one, we have the financial codes, and then, so Kim is working and Deborah is working. Kim is working on the financial codes. Deborah's working on the Siebel codes. Siebel is our CRM. So although they won't necessarily enter project data, because this is a constituent for us, they need to have an ID within our CRM. So those are sort of a couple of functions that are happening. And then we're, again, running that updated summary report because it's the differentiation between the application summary and now that final summary. And then at the same time, the contract is being generated and pre-populated. If you remember very early on, we were working with corporate counsel to establish the collaborative agreement, either the collaborative agreement or the amendment. And then the contract or the amendment is being pre-populated by Deborah and Kim. We pre-populate again to make sure that the data are accurate and consistent with the proposal that has been approved. And then that goes on to the division. So the contracts are provided to the division and the grantee. Now this is maybe an area where I have a question because I'm not sure if it's in flux now or if it's in contracts now. That's still a question for me, and I'm not sure if Kim is on because I think she was in the conference room. But we'll need to understand how the contract is actually submitted, how the contract is distributed to the grant recipient, and how it comes back to CHI.
Yeah, from what I understand, and that it's the contract is just going to be loaded into Flux after it comes back from iContract.
Okay.
Yeah, as it's just saying, I think that's correct because all what I've understood is that everything contract related we still would do the same way except for the actual application itself. And then that would be a storage place to actually hold it so that we could at least have everything in one place after it's all done.
Okay.
This is Cheryl. I agree with what you just said.
Okay. So once we receive, so we may need to clarify these steps to include that once the divisions submit the completed contracts, then there needs to be a line that indicates that the contracts are uploaded into Flux.
Do you think right about here?
Yes. Yep.
Oh.
I'm sorry, it should be above.
It should be above, you're right. Yeah.
Hi, Cheryl. I didn't realize you were on.
Yeah, I'm on mute. Sorry.
It's okay.
So, quick question: when you say that Kim is going to collaborate with finance, is that collaborating with Cheryl?
No, that'd be with me, Jeff.
Oh, okay.
Janelle, to the extent you have the Siebel IDs for the projects, how would that be related then to your RFA numbers?
So there's a section within the RFA to capture if there's an existing Siebel ID, but it does not interfere or coincide in any way with the RFA or the RFPF ID.
And I want to go back to that question you asked a second ago. This is Cheryl about the finance. That is true to the extent this relates to the CHI grant making, but there will be some government grant making as well coming out of this. And I know we're specifically talking about CHI here, but.
That's good. It's good to know. What does EPRF stand for?
You know, I cannot remember. It's a lowercase e and the PRF or capitalized. But Jeff, Cheryl, do you remember what that's for?
It's our electronic payment software that pays our invoices.
Okay, thank you.
So we disperse the funding. Usually it's just the very first disbursement, and it just occurred to me that we don't acknowledge within this workflow that there would be more than one disbursement. So that's just an important note. So the first payment is dispersed. The way that our disbursements work, they're either, and this is acknowledged within the contract, it's either 2 disbursements or 3. 2 disbursements if the proposal does not require that they hire new staff in order to execute the program of work. They receive 75% within 30 days of that executed contract, the last 25% 30 days after submitting the final report. However, if hiring a new staff person is required, they only receive the first 25% 30 days after the collaborative agreement is signed, and that additional 50% is not provided until we have evidence that the person has been hired. And then that third disbursement occurs the same as the original sequencing, which is 30 days after the final report is submitted. And so I'm not sure how you want to reference that within this workflow, but just wanted to be sure that you were aware of the variation.
That's good. What we should do is we should just put in that we have three different milestone reports that are required. One if there's a payment, one if there's staff hired, and 2 if there are so these reports make payments contingent, or the payments are contingent upon these reports being submitted.
Only on the final one.
Payment is only contingent on the final one?
Well, so the first payment is automatic. Once the contract is signed, the first payment is automatic. Now, if the first payment is 75 versus 25%, that is contingent upon whether or not they indicated they needed staff in order to do the grant funded program of work.
And this is Justine. This part would be, I'm guessing, configurable based on the actual application requirement.
And that's actually what I'm thinking too. Is that what we're talking about right now is where we are today, but it may be in the future that we modify that even further. And so I guess at this point we would want a system that says, okay, we want a payment here, and then upon certain I guess deliverables or approval from staff, okay, we can go ahead and issue that payment, and then later the same thing. I mean, I don't know that we want to create a something in stone simply strictly for the current process as much as we want to create something that we can use for the current as well as future process.
Yeah.
I would agree with that, Jeff.
I agree with that too.
Agreed. Because we already, with the government grants that we make, it's a cost reimbursement basis, so it's very variable.
Right.
And I'm guessing we're going to have a separate meeting about monitoring and reporting, right? Is that the plan?
Yes, we'll follow up with these as well.
That's a whole other conversation.
That's a whole other discussion, and we're going to follow up with this discussion as well once we start, developing some of the requirements and some of the build. So, it's a recircle effort.
And then while we're on here, sorry, just my last question. For Siebel, I know Siebel's come up, and I see it's coming up too about towards the end. Global, we don't utilize Siebel, and historically it's for a few reasons. I think some things weren't compatible. If that step needs to be skipped, say for us, is that an option? Because we would not be reintegrating with that system most likely.
Yeah, we'll most likely we will be creating a separate workflow as did, for global.
As the application develops. Okay, great. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, so once we sort of provide the first disbursement, the project begins, and then the feasible opportunities, essentially what's happening here, the program cycle, I mean, this is just the beginning, and I think, Ken, this is what you were getting to earlier in describing this workflow. This does not take into account the real work that happens.
Yeah.
This is just the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, each one of these processes, I mean, there are multiple tasks and multiple steps under each one of these processes. So, you know, as I was doing an import into Excel, you had about 73 different line items here, and I'm thinking, okay, that's 73 of about 285 that probably take place, and then some beyond that. So, clearly understood.
Okay.
Now,
Ken, Richard, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was say, why I have you still on the phone? Do you guys have a specific program planning methodology that you use?
Program planning methodology. That's really vague. Tell me what you mean.
At the foundation that my wife works at, they use a methodology for target to action, where they're basically specifying the types, the objective up front, the milestones and the activities they want to use in order to get there. They collect their metrics, and then they generate informed reports to kind of go back to their sponsors. And there's a methodology that I guess they teach at a university somewhere that's called target to action, and that's what it was based on. I was wondering if you guys have any similar kind of formal program development methodologies, specifically so that you have measurable outcomes at the end, because I know your stuff is very measurable.
Right. So the only thing that I would point to in response to that question would be our operational framework. It essentially dictates what we do, how we do it, but it's also providing some operational recommendations to divisions and their applicants or their partnering applicants. That's probably as close as we would get to something like that. Richard, okay. Would that be of value to share with you?
Actually, it would be, because as I'm creating the forms and I'm creating the structure of what goes where, I mean, I want it to be, obviously I'd like it to line up as closely as possible to kind of what and how you go about doing your work.
Okay.
So.
Okay, we can definitely get that over to you.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm glad you asked that question, Janelle, because I thought it was leaning more towards something like a scorecard or something like that for the board, or even a corporate funder report.
Okay, Janelle, thank you so much for your time. I know that we've gone over, and we're going to tag you again. As we develop this thing, we're gonna ask for more of your time, and I'm going to ask you now if there is a better time or a good time for you on a regular basis, like on a weekly basis or a specific day that is easier for you to maybe spend an hour and a half with us to discuss where we are and maybe validate some of the processes and requirements that we put together.
Actually, you know what? I just answered a similar question for Kim, I think 2 days ago. And Kim, for the life of me, I cannot even remember what that date and time was that I gave you. And that's related to the SMS project. Do you recall? Because it likely is going to be
Tuesday.
The same day. Okay, let's see.
Tuesdays, I think it was at 11 Central or 10 Central.
Okay, let's see.
Okay.
Hold on, just one.
Alternatively, we can always look on the have Kenita look on the calendar and make sure you're available during the time that we're looking at it. But it might be like weekly meetings at the least that we would like to have you or one of your staff be represented here, because you, CHI, and Global are really a huge core element to this next grant making process, obviously. And you know, the more available you are during this time, the quicker and more concise we're able to do the build.
Okay. Actually, I looked at through the month of May, and Tuesdays at 2 Central would be the next block that I see sort of more consistently than others that would be open.
Okay.
Oh, that's good. Okay.
Now, the challenge for me will be also understanding that I may need you to be patient with me, because my travel schedule also will get in the way sometimes. So I have to say this too, because I was cringing. I wasn't sure if you all heard this, but when I came back into my hotel room, it was being serviced, and there was a bit of a language barrier existing between myself and the person servicing the room, and she was cleaning while I was talking. And so it was a little bit of a distraction, but as long as you all can bear with me through things like that, I think that we can make this happen.
Yeah, that's great.
You know, we've gone through all sorts of strange different sounds on the phones. It's not a problem at all.
Good.
And Janelle, you'd also said that Kim and Nadar would be both available to for quick touch base meetings and understand the process very well. So
yes,
we will be reaching out to them probably on a more frequent basis over the next couple of weeks, just maybe to bounce ideas off of them, to verify, so we can use your time as wisely as we can, and make those sessions that we have with you productive.
I appreciate that. And then too, at some point, and I'm not sure because I'll play this by ear based upon the DA's comfort level, but at some point you may also see a complete shift where I may completely step out of the decision making here, because Nada is absolutely going to be your point person at some point into the future.
Okay.
Okay. We definitely appreciate your time here, and while we have you, we will take advantage of that time. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your ability as well.
Yeah, I think that's the end of this session. We will circle back with you and let you know when the next one is and what we have next. But we definitely appreciate the time, guys. Is there any other questions or wrap up that anyone has before we close the session?
None for me.
Nothing for me, but thank you.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.